surrendered territory of the Mississaugas of New Credit, Anishinaabe, the Haudenosaunee, and the Huron-Wendat, who are the rightful title holders and stewards of this land. I'd also like to acknowledge that we're invited to the Dish with One Spoon Treaty in the spirit of peace, friendship, and respect. Today, we're all calling in from different locations, and I encourage all of us who are non-Indigenous to learn about the land that we're on today. As we start this webinar, I'd like us to keep in mind that Black, Indigenous, and people of color who have been and continue to be disproportionately impacted by pollution, climate change, and environmental injustice. Environmental defense is going to set the stage for the conversation, so I'm going to try and do that. And then we're going to go into a conversation with Rachel and another panelist, Sam, who I'm hoping you can join us. And then we will have some time for questions at the end, I think. And if not, I'll let you know. And in any case, write them into the chat. And if we don't get to them today, we will be answering them in our follow-up email that is going to occur after the webinar is over. And we'll make that available to you and be able to answer your questions. So I just want to give a little bit of a background on the issue of climate change and Environmental Defense's view on it and the kind of work that we do and how that led us to be very interested in this topic that we're covering today. We know that Canada as a country has a disproportionate role to play in addressing climate change, and that's because we contribute disproportionately on a global scale to the problem that is out there. We're in the top 9 polluting countries in the world. We're either the first or second, depending on the year, in terms of our per capita contribution to the pollution that causes climate change. We also have a history of failed climate commitments that our governments have made on our behalf, including the most recent ones, most high profile one made at the 2015 COP, the Conference of the Parties, or the Paris Agreement, as I'm sure most of you have heard. Where we made a commitment to drastically reduce our emissions, but in fact, instead, they've gone up since that time. We also heavily subsidize our fossil fuel industry, second highest level of subsidies in the world. And we continue apace at this despite commitments to reduce it. In fact, you may have seen in the news today, for example, that the federal government just approved a new billion-barrel oil field off the coast of Newfoundland and Labrador. And that came just a day after that, the IPCC report had come out, and the Secretary General of the United Nations, told us all that further investments in fossil fuel development was a moral and economic disaster and failing. So we have a problem in this country in that we are continuing to invest in expansion of fossil fuel extraction at the very time when we should be reducing our emissions and moving to a cleaner energy system. The consequences, of course, of not making that move are underscored almost on a daily basis, both from the science community, as we saw with the IPCC report this week, but also in the real world lived experience of Canadians. All of the high profile catastrophic events that continue to occur with increasing frequency are on your computer screens and on your televisions and on the radio. You'll all remember the combination of disasters that struck British Columbia last year and the prairie provinces, droughts followed by fires, followed by floods. And of course, these get worse every year, dislocate thousands of people, and costs us all billions of dollars and ruin people's lives. Although, it's really interesting with all this stuff going on that our government still doubled down on expanding fossil fuel extraction. And, it's up to us to hold them accountable. We'll get into that a little bit later. But I also want to just draw our attention to the fact that, despite these high profile events that in the news, a lot of things that are going on the ground that impact communities just don't make it to the, burning houses, massive floods kind of stage. And that includes impacts on communities in our north, and in particular Indigenous communities. many of the changes that are occurring there are occurring a little bit more slowly. So the winters get shorter, they get warmer, the springs change time, the migration of wildlife changes the time in which that occurs. The migration of wildlife, birds, mammals, etc., those change, and they're changing quite quickly. But because they're more subtle and you don't see the flames on television, I think a lot of us learn less about it. So today what we're going to do is dive into what some of those impacts look like in communities in the northern part of our country, in particular indigenous communities, which are disproportionately impacted by these changes. And we're going to find out more why that is true, why they are disproportionately impacted, what some of those changes are, and what it is that we collectively need to learn about this, and what we can do about it. So I'm just going to dive right in by introducing Rachel LaFortune, who's the report that her organization has done is I think really illuminating, and I think you'll find that as well. Rachel's a researcher with the Environment and Human Rights Division at Human Rights Watch, where her current work is focused on human rights violations in the context of climate change and environmental health. So perfect for our topic today. Before joining Human Rights Watch, Rachel carried out research and advocacy on a number of human rights issues, including the impact of resource development on Indigenous communities' right to water, health, and culture in Canada, and also in Papua New Guinea. Rachel holds a law degree from Columbia Law School and speaks English and French. So welcome, Rachel. Great to have you here today. And I don't know if you want to add anything to my introduction, or we just want to dive right into our questions.
No, yeah, thank you, Tim. Ready to dive right in.
Great, great. So as a research that focuses on the intersection of environment and human rights, why did you see it was so important to help tell the story of climate change impacts on First Nations? And maybe just tell us a little about what your report found in terms of what some of those common impacts are, and then why did you think it was so important to work on this?
Yeah, thanks, Tim. I mean, I think as you so eloquently and perfectly indicated, both in your land acknowledgement and in your summary of the massive role that Canada plays as a significant emitter and as a country that has so far embarrassingly failed to reduce emissions, this is a climate justice story. So not just on the mitigation front, though, of course, there's also the question of how Canada, as a country that is contributing to the global climate crisis, is also on the front lines of experiencing some of the most rapid and significant climate impacts as a country, warming at 2 to 3 times the global rate. And of course, as we know, the impacts of that warming are not experienced equally or not evenly distributed. And it's often communities such as First Nations who are already marginalized that are in fact on the front lines of these impacts, and at the same time less resourced to be able to proactively manage and prepare for these types of impacts. So this report came out of wanting to highlight the stories of First Nations who, in the face of this, incredible changes to their traditional territories, to the lands that they depend on for sustenance, to maintain culture, are making valiant efforts to persevere in the face of those impacts, but also in the face of government at the provincial and at the federal level, not living up to their human rights obligations to support communities in adapting to climate harms. So in terms of kind of some of the impacts that we documented and the scope of what is being experienced, we looked at a number of First Nations in Northern Ontario, in Yukon, in British Columbia, and while there are differences in experiences, the commonalities and the patterns across the board are quite striking in the ways in which climate change impacts are making access to traditional foods increasingly dangerous and difficult. Both as harvesting and hunting conditions become more treacherous as climate patterns shift, as ice thins, as permafrost melts, but also how the species that they rely on since time immemorial are increasingly less available or less accessible because they're taking different migration routes. And that on top of that, when community members can't harvest enough food, enough traditional food from the land, they're forced to rely on store-bought food, often sold through like one grocery store that's available in remote northern communities where food is shipped in at extremely high expense through ridiculous supply chains that are also becoming more costly as a result of climate change impacts. And for many community members, the cost of accessing healthy foods at these stores is just not within reasonable access. And so people are eating more highly processed foods, not fruits and vegetables, which of course contributes to existing health inequalities for northern and remote First Nations.
Great, thanks. Yeah, I've spent quite a bit of time in some northern communities, and I know like the northern store prices are always just crazy, and I can only imagine with the recent inflationary pressures that exist, just how extreme they must be. You also mentioned just the difference between some of the food that is easy to or that you can find in the northern stores. Maybe just dive into some of the nutritional aspects of this. The comparison between some of the country food that people would normally access or be able to access, and what it is that's durable products on the shelf of a supermarket.
No, exactly. I mean, when we're talking about traditional foods, we're talking about, wild meat, caribou, salmon, traditional medicines, herbs and berries, diets that, health studies have shown have incredibly nutritional benefit and an ability to help First Nations people avoid significant health costs, such as, diabetes and other types of illnesses and health impacts that are being disproportionately experienced by First Nations communities, in large part because of the increasing reliance on store-bought processed foods. And we especially heard this from families with children, right, in terms of increased dependence on sort of high processed cereals, grains, breads and junk foods that are more affordable, have a longer shelf life, and are lighter to ship to the northern remote stores, and therefore don't come at as high a cost than canned goods, much less fresh fruit or vegetables, which are even when affordable, often past sort of best purchase date or in very poor condition by the time they make it to northern remote stores.
Yeah, it's some of the same issues, I guess, that people see in the South, where people that have limited financial means, may end up being pushed into buying foods that are not particularly nutritious, et cetera, but compounded by just distance and cost in the North, so it makes it even worse. And when people can't either supplement or substitute that with country foods that they would normally access, it creates a real crisis. So I want to shift gears a little bit to like the people that you encountered when you were doing this great report. If you just tell us a little bit about how you actually collected the information about the impacts that are going on the ground, and maybe give us a bit of a visual sense of where across the country did you visit, and give people a bit of a visual picture of the map of Canada and the people that you chatted with.
Yeah, absolutely. Sorry. So this was probably a longer project than is usual for Human Rights Watch. Altogether, the research for this report took about 2 years. And a big part of that was, relationship building, securing trust from the First Nations involved in this research, and ensuring that that they were on board with our involvement and the direction of the report, and maintaining their involvement throughout. And so, of course, one of the main contributions in terms of information and expertise that we relied on in this research was interviewing community members, First Nations leaders, and particularly elders and traditional knowledge holders who just had a wealth of information on the changes that they're witnessing, and that they can testify to in terms of the impacts climate change has wrought on traditional foods, on hunting practices. And it was staggering, really. And also just in follow-up with, scientific experts reading peer-reviewed research documents to verify, seeing how time and time again, the knowledge elders and traditional harvesters hold was just, being verified at every turn. Of course, we interviewed and engaged with a number of actors beyond First Nations community members as well. There was a lot of outreach to government, to apprise them of our findings, solicit, their feedback and information, provide an opportunity for them to respond to what we found. Some responded at more length than others. So the federal government, I will say, was quite active in engaging with us in response to our findings. The Ontario government, not so much, not at all, in fact. So, take from that what you will. Additionally, we had a lot of outreach to frontline service providers, folks who work in schools, food banks, medical providers, because, one of the key impacts that we were documenting was the impact of rising food security on children. And understandably, there's a lot of stigma around struggling to feed your child or your children. And especially for First Nations communities and First Nations parents, a very real fear about child apprehension and the very real and troubling practice and the disproportionate impact of children being taken away from their families and First Nations communities, essentially because of poverty.
Mm-hmm. And when you were talking to community members, you alluded to differential responses from different levels of government. I'm not particularly surprised by your comment about the Ontario government, given that it dismantled the entire climate program in Ontario when they were elected in 2018. But did you find that particular communities that you were interviewing, people in those communities, had very different experiences with what was going on the land as a result of climate change? I mean, it's a very, very large country. Can you highlight some of the differences that you saw on the ground?
Yeah, I think what was most striking was, in fact, that the differences were so few, because even though we're looking at different species and different cultures, different for communities in the Skeena River watershed in BC, it was more about reliance on salmon, impacts on moose. For the Vuntut Gwitchin First Nation in Old Crow, the most farthest north First Nation in Canada, more impacts on the porcupine caribou herd that migrates between Alaska and Yukon. Also salmon, but obviously from a different watershed. And for communities in Northern Ontario, Weenus First Nation, Attawapiskat First Nation, more impacts on caribou as well, but also specific impacts on migratory birds. But sort of, regardless of what the traditional food species was, across the board, we were hearing challenges around just difficulty in accessing traditional harvesting grounds, whether that's because of increased forest fire activity in British Columbia, or shifting ice and snow patterns in Yukon or Northern Ontario, changing freeze-thaw cycles that mean that normal traditional hunting routes that would be safe are suddenly not safe, and in ways where it's very difficult to know or judge. And across the board, also the fear and experience that how these changes are impacting the transmission of traditional knowledge and hunting practices to young people in the community, it being increasingly dangerous, especially, and more challenging for younger people to be out on the land and participating in traditional harvesting. And so what that means, not just in terms of the right to food and food security, but also the transmission of cultural knowledge and the maintaining of cultural identity across generations, and how that in turn impacts on mental health.
Absolutely. If people are cut off from their ability to collect food and practice their culture, then how do you pass that on to the next generation? And if the methods that you've used and have evolved over long periods of time are no longer effective, it's very challenging, I would imagine, to like adapt those when things are changing so rapidly. Obviously, communities can adapt, but the pace and scale of climate change in northern Canada is such that just because something happens this way this year doesn't mean it's going to be that way the next year. It's interesting because a lot of people that try to downplay the significance of the changes that are occurring as a result of climate change tend to dismiss it as, oh well, it's just going to be warmer. Isn't that good because we're in Canada and wouldn't it be nicer if it was warmer? Spring would come earlier. But I think your findings really underscore that it's the ecological changes that occur as the result of this overall warmer weather is essentially, it's not climate change, it's climate instability that is occurring and climate dislocation. So I think that's really important for people to understand. I have a question here that was relevant to just what you were talking about that's come in from one of our participants. So I think I'll just ask you it now. I think it's Maral is asking here, is there specific subgroups of people in the community or groups of people in the community that are disproportionately impacted? And she uses an example of such as children or women who are being impacted, say, more than the entire community.
Yeah, absolutely. So certainly children, as I mentioned, in terms, we really saw a lot of testimonies about the importance of school food programs, which are not universally available across Canada. There, is a more recent commitment by the federal government to fund and support a national school food program, but that unfortunately is not moving forward as quickly as it could. So certainly kids seeing a lot of unique impacts as a result of household food insecurity, but we also documented particular impacts on older people and people with chronic health conditions, people for whom it's particularly necessary to maintain a healthy diet or follow medically advised diet, and for whom doing so is just not possible often because of not bringing in the expected harvest, not being able to afford healthy food at the store. And what that means in terms of skipping meals in ways that can often exacerbate underlying health conditions.
And there is a disproportionate vulnerability to things like diabetes in a lot of these communities as well, right? From high levels of processed food, sugars, et cetera, which, the people that have lived on country food, in particular high protein diets, are not evolved. Like their physiological systems are not evolved to high sugar diets, right? So you fundamentally change that diet, and then especially for people that are older and maybe vulnerable to diabetes, it can be a huge problem, I think.
Yeah, there's a very high prevalence of diabetes rates among First Nations, and at increasingly younger ages than we would expect to see. And as I said, studies have shown that traditional diets have a powerful preventative effect, protecting against instances of diabetes and providing the nutrients that First Nations community members need and have a right to.
You, in your report, you talk about, I was talking about it too. The federal government hasn't done enough to prevent climate change, but you spoke to that about how that failure constitutes a violation of human rights for First Nations. Can you just kind of expand on that from your perspective about, federal and provincial inaction on this file?
Yeah, so I think as at the outset, important to emphasize that governments, including Canada and including governments within Canada, so looking at the provinces and territories, have a human rights obligation to prevent foreseeable harm from climate change. So that both entails reducing emissions to prevent the worst outcomes of climate change, but then also supporting communities in adapting to current impacts and the impacts that we know are coming as a result of scientific assessments. And Unfortunately, Canada has a lot of work to do on this front. So not just on the mitigation emissions reduction front, but when it comes to preparation for the imminent harms that we know are going to be experienced. At the provincial level, looking at Ontario, Tim, as you mentioned, the Ford government literally cut pretty much, all the climate programs on day one. So needless to say, a significant gap there. The federal government has made an effort to provide some climate adaptation funding, some support for First Nations, for example, to be monitoring the impacts of climate change within their traditional territories, some funding to address impacts on health and food. There is, of course, also the federal subsidy, the Nutrition North Canada subsidy that's meant to help reduce store-bought imported food costs in northern and remote communities. But the problem, of course, being that the allocated funds are not enough. They're scattered over a broad swath of separate funding pots from different, within different federal departments and ministries that make it incredibly onerous and difficult for First Nations to navigate where they can go to, for assistance, for the government support that they're entitled to. And of course, all of this is ultimately a Band-Aid on what is the larger problem of doing everything that we can to reduce emissions to prevent more dramatic change than we know is already going to occur at the level of warming that we're locked into.
Yeah, I mean, that is the challenge, is that we're not doing enough to limit emissions, but we're also not keeping ahead of the adaptation curve, like the scientists would describe it. Like we know that some change is locked in, the amount that's locked in gets worse every day. And yet we just really aren't on top of providing the needs for people now, never mind the scale of change that's likely to occur if we meet our emission reduction targets.
No, and we know that Canada is not alone in this. There's a significant gap when we look at funding and when we look at climate financing and programming, right? There's a real focus on mitigation efforts as opposed to on adaptation sort of across the board. But then sort of when you layer that on top of the context of impacts on First Nations communities that are facing, already the cost of historic lack of investment and marginalization, shoddy infrastructure, and an existing funding gap that is staggering in terms of already putting them in a position of making it more difficult to respond to impacts, much less be in a place to proactively manage. That said, First Nations are leading some of the most, innovative efforts, I think. Sam, who unfortunately is not able to join us today, is a climate change monitor in his community in Northern Ontario. And doing incredible work monitoring the impacts of permafrost thaw, what that means for impacts on traditional species, to better understand and situate his community and being able to respond to those changes. The Vuntagwitchin First Nation in northern Yukon has piloted a solar panel project that is getting their community off of diesel reliance, and did so in consultation with elders and grandmothers in their community to make sure that the solar panels did not impact berry harvesting, something that was of particular cultural importance to women in the community. And when we look at First Nations in the Skeena River watershed, the networks of traditional food sharing, where we have, we see First Nations from across BC sharing salmon, across watersheds, essentially for communities to be able to maintain cultural practices at times when their watersheds are depleted or especially suffering partly as a result of climate change impacts.
Yes, I've heard of communities trying to do things like start up greenhouse operations and things too, which are definitely not, traditional source of food in a northern area. but in an effort to try and replace some of the higher quality food items that are just not available really when you're trying to fly them in at great cost, but also create a hub of community interest and investment and activity right in the community. So some of these things are hopeful as well. In particular, the investment in alternative energy that you described, wind and solar as well, local autonomy and much lower pollution levels and greater reliability from modern technology there. So I think that's really hopeful as well. I see a question that was kind of related to that harvesting of country food here in the chat. Someone asking, Debbie asking if there's data available at some of the community level about reduction in harvest yields. Like are the communities able to actually quantify the drop in availability that's occurring, and have they been able to do that so that they can use that in advocating for some of these issues?
Yeah, thanks for that question, Debbie. The lack of data is certainly one of the biggest problems underpinning understanding the full scope of harm and empowering communities and the government to be able to respond appropriately. Sam, being one of the essentially only people who was able to receive government funding to support that type of data collection. But he's just one guy in one community across all of the vast swaths of Northern Ontario, where there are many other First Nations who also need the same type of support to be able to actively monitor and quantify that type of impact. So yeah, certainly a real need for more government financial support to flow directly to First Nations to be able to do that type of community level monitoring.
Yes, when the government changed here in Ontario, there was about $3 billion in the account dedicated to working on climate mitigation adaptation, and that was derived from the cap and trade program that was in place around emissions. So the new government immediately moved to cancel that program, and I met with the new Minister of Environment and Climate Change at that time, just before they changed the name of the ministry to no longer include climate change. But and that was Rod Phillips, and he expressed to me how happy he was to be able to rescind all of that funding and cancel all of the work that was underway on mitigation and adaptation. I remember sitting in the dining room at Queen's Park at the legislature while he told me this, and I just thought, like, what planet am I living on? That the Minister of Environment and Climate Change is gleefully telling me how he's going to stop work on this incredibly important area.
Truly, and it was so devastating. Also, just obviously just having the funding cut, but also the way in which it was done. Sam's told me about just essentially having no warning and waking up and finding out that the funds that support your essential work are gone, and having to scramble to find alternatives. And at a time when you're already beyond capacity, already doing the work of 10 people essentially. We certainly saw the impact of that type of situation in our work. One of the communities featured in our report, their lead person on climate change lost their funding, and the role disappeared. There was no ability to maintain continuity, and ended up working with their natural resources mining contact to try and salvage that relationship. But just the way in which inadequate government funding is continually putting First Nations in this position of having to scramble for resources to respond to really pressing and urgent climate impact needs, on top of course, even more urgent and pressing immediate needs in terms of access to clean drinking water, among many, many other issues.
Yeah, I've spent some time in Attawapiskat and some of the other communities along the Hudson's Bay coast where Sam is from, and there are so many other, pre-existing issues around, being isolated and, having communities that were moved off the land into communities which, they didn't used to live in, because people moved more across the land seasonally, et cetera. So all those pre-existing problems are now being compounded by massive flood events and, the changes in wildlife migration that you've documented and stuff as well. So having governments, pull the rug out from under that kind of stuff is truly shocking. And the scale of it, I think, in Ontario is something we always need to remind ourselves about. In just over a year of the cap and trade emissions program running, there was almost $3 billion that was collected. And just by way of scale, the entire commitment of the federal government to climate action over multiple years across the entire country is only $9 billion. So Ontario was generating a massive amount of money for investment in these programs, and it all disappeared when the election occurred in 2018. So quite catastrophic, I think. If you had to choose some priority program area investments, Rachel, from your conversations with communities, what do you think that they would say are the top priorities for money in the adaptation space?
I can't speak on behalf of communities, but certainly just in terms of recommendations coming out of our research, increased funding for community-based climate monitoring, health adaptation efforts, addressing impacts on food. We did see after the report in budget 2021 from the federal government, at the time, pretty significant commitment to funding to address climate impacts on health and on food for Inuit and First Nations. But of course, even seemingly significant amounts of money, ultimately, when you get down to the individual community level, don't amount to much, and are time bound as well. And financial commitments are all well and good, but the next step then being implementation, how that money is allocated, ensuring that as much of it as possible flows directly to communities and not isn't frittered away on outside government bureaucracy. So a lot of work still to do there.
For sure. I see a question here from another one from Morel. She's just asking, is there places to go to read more about, some of these issues related to human rights violations, related to climate change and environmental degradation? Any particular place that you might send our listeners and viewers today? Any additional reports? We're going to put your report in, Rachel, into the chat here. So people get that one so they can directly read that. There it is. But I see that Suzanne or Grace has put that in here. But anything in addition that you would recommend folks have a look at?
Yeah, if you're interested in and looking not just at Canada, would certainly recommend checking out Human Rights Watch's climate change page and research that we've done more broadly as well. If specifically looking to read more about climate impacts on First Nations or on Indigenous peoples, let me think. Well, there's the Assembly of First Nations has a sponsored study that is really quite powerful on issues around food insecurity and environmental harm. The name of it, unfortunately, is escaping my memory right now. But all to say that, certainly checking out the Assembly of First Nations, ITK, both have great materials on climate change impacts and resources for learning more. And in general, feel free to follow up with my Twitter page. I'm frequently posting articles on this.
thanks. I have some more questions here that come in from the audience. A couple that came in just before we got started. And we have one here, no name attached to this one, but she says she's a great grandmother of 2 children under the ages of 8. She's kind of worried about the future, like what do they have to look forward to? So, when you're talking to people, Rachel, in these communities, and from your perspective too, like, what do people see the future of? Like, how do they find hope and all, with the kind of scale of the problem that we're seeing out there? How do people find hope in looking forward?
Yeah, thank you for that question. I think that's so important because so often in this type of research and, when discussing these types of impacts, particularly, I think, in the context of looking at climate impacts on Indigenous peoples, there's this sense of, oh, what is there, like, can we even save the natural resources needed to maintain these cultures and ways of life? And people can get into these kind of like nihilistic, hopeless headspaces about that. And that, especially as a white settler, and people coming to this type of work from that position of privilege is, important to avoid that. I will say that when, in speaking with First Nations community members, I am continually inspired by the work that they are doing, the hope that they have, that, Indigenous cultures in Canada have survived, incredible harm and oppression. And in many ways, climate change is sort of the unfortunate next wave of colonial impacts on Indigenous peoples in Canada. And it behooves us as settlers to keep in mind kind of the obligations that we have coming out of that history, just as it behooves Canadian governments to remember their human rights obligations are not lessened by there are no sort of excuses for the Canadian government to turn to. They have obligations to meet, and the means, both financial and technological, to do so. It's merely a question of political will at this point.
Yeah, thanks. And a question here from Kelly, and I think this builds on what you were just saying, is that the commitment that Canada's made to implementing UNDRIP, or the UN Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous People, for those who don't like acronyms. So how does that relate to this in terms of climate action? Is there anything beyond what we've talked about? Is there anything fundamental to the UNDRIP commitment itself that you'd want to highlight?
Yeah, I mean, I think certainly the UN Declaration is one of a body of human rights treaties and conventions that Canada has agreed to be a party to, and that trigger those obligations that we're speaking of in terms of obligations to uphold Indigenous peoples' rights to culture, to health, to a healthy environment. The list goes on, the right to food, of course. And in terms of sort of, specific obligations, I think that sort of we've covered that also there.
Another question from Paul, which is, I guess, is related, but it focuses in on pressure for resource extraction, because as we know, like in Northern Ontario, for example, which we've spoken a bit today about in particular, there's huge pressure for new mining activity and what's the area known as the Ring of Fire, which is only Indigenous people live in that area of far Northern Ontario. And thoughts on that in terms of decision making, future prospects for improved healthcare, financial success, employment, etc. Any thoughts on that from the communities that you've spoken to, Rachel?
Yeah, I can't speak particularly specifically to the Ring of Fire necessarily. I haven't done research there, but sort of certainly see how it relates directly to our report on climate impacts on First Nations rights to food, Of course, resource extraction within the context of climate change is, another added harm that is impacting First Nations access to traditional food, whether that's resource extraction in the term, of fossil fuels, or of, what's being pitched as transition minerals needed to move us away from fossil fuel dependence. And certainly we would not want to see any efforts, as part of that transition, modeling the same problematic, not human rights respecting patterns that we've seen in fossil fuel extraction by Canadian companies and in Canada.
Yeah, it's an area that I've had some involvement in the past, for sure, and that has been one of the the big challenges is both the dislocation of large-scale industrial activities within First Nation communities, like huge diamond mine that was near Attawapskat, for example, in northern Ontario, or the tar sands in Alberta, and then and the communities who are being impacted not consenting to them in the first place, but also not benefiting adequately from the economic activity that is being generated from that. I see one of the panelists asked what happened to the money that was from cap and trade in Ontario. Well, I can tell you what happened to the money. About $1 billion went out to pay legal fees. The Ontario government canceled all of the renewable energy contracts that they'd signed with people that were building wind farms and solar farms, etc. And they lost many lawsuits over those canceled contracts, so had to pay costs ordered by the courts. The rest of it was drawn into general government revenues and spent on other things that the provincial government spends its money on. Another question here. This is like, how do we communicate the impacts of, this is a question not just for you, Rachel, or for the communities you work with, but I guess for all of us who are here today. But, we have the fossil fuel industries, which, I think, I don't think it's an overstatement to say have captured our governments. I mean, the decisions that we see continuously made in the face of the threat of climate change, just tells me that our governments are captured by them. What can we do to make people more aware of this situation, and so that we don't continue to make these horrible mistakes that happen day after day in this country?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think so much of it comes down to just spreading awareness within our own communities and networks, having the awkward conversation on climate change, if need be, with people who, need to be reached on that. Sharing the information you've heard here, the stories you read elsewhere, news outlets like the Narwhal, I will say, are doing, an incredible job of covering aspects of this across Canada, but also in Ontario. And just, the continual need to have these conversations and reckon with these impacts and with the policies that our governments have put in place.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, the best, the people who you're going to have the most influence on are the people who are your friends and family. And then maybe secondarily, the people that you interact with through your social media spaces, et cetera. I mean, we've seen in this country how poisonous information can spread through social media. Well, real information can also spread that way. So it's really important to try and influence the conversation that occurs in the circles that you operate in. I see another question here from Diane, because Rachel, you've had experience in Papua New Guinea. Have you seen parallels to the impacts that are occurring climatologically, but also in terms of human rights between New Guinea and your experience here in Canada?
Unfortunately, yes. Tim, I think it sort of speaks to what you were addressing earlier in terms of, the impacts of resource extraction projects that, have so much local harm. Perhaps promise development or jobs very rarely deliver on those promises. and meanwhile bring a scope of long-term environmental impacts and other harms related to their operations in the area. The project I was involved with in Papua New Guinea in particular was a Canadian owned and operated gold mine that has had a devastating impact on Indigenous communities in that area. So certainly a lot of scope for comparison between Canadian companies operating abroad and the harms that we see domestically as well.
Yeah, and I think people may not be aware of something that I didn't know until a few years ago, just the degree to which Canada is the world's miner. So many of the mining companies are Canadian. A big source of capital for the global mining industry is raised on the Toronto Stock Exchange. And I think that we as Canadians should have expectations around the behavior of Canadian-based companies in other parts of the world and here, of course, but also other parts of the world, and that they, if they're going to operate in these places, that they receive consent from the people where they're operating, and that they deliver benefits as well as impacts to the communities that they operate in. So often we hear of Canadian mining companies aligning themselves with very regressive governments and not only not delivering benefits, but actually significantly harming the people that are in the countries where they operate. So there's a huge need for reform in their practices, I think, there as well.
On that note, I might just flag two positive developments in that there were two private members' bills introduced recently. One that would require human rights due diligence by Canadian companies operating abroad, and the other which would reform Canada's human rights ombuds, which was created a few years ago, ostensibly with the intent to empower independent investigations of human rights harms by Canadian companies, international operations in certain sectors, including the mining sector, but which, unfortunately at its creation was not given the powers it needed to operate effectively. And so this new bill could be the answer to helping address that. So fingers crossed.
Yeah, that's great. Are those private members' bills?
Yes, yeah. So one introduced by Heather McPherson, and the other by Peter Julian, I believe.
Oh, great. Yeah. These kind of things are really good to learn about, and we can always hope that they could be passed or even picked up by government. And I suppose
Exactly.
there's some chance, and become government bills, which then increases their chances of being passed. And there may be some increased possibility for some of these things to get passed because of the work that the NDP and the Liberals have committed to doing together over the next 3.5, 4 years. So that's really hopeful as well. We're getting close to the end here. So I just want to step back a little bit and just talk about kind of what's next in terms of what we would like people to do, the people that have attended this webinar today. And I saw that we were up around 100 people. So that's 100 people who can do something. So Rachel, if you want to take a start here, what do you want the 100 people that are listening to today to take away from this and do in their communities and do with the decision makers that represent them?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's sort of what we were just talking about, in that, if you can share what you've learned with someone else in your life today, and, as a next step, of course, making those advocacy choices in your day-to-day life with the folks in your community, to reckon with Canada's role as a top emitter, as a top, public financer of fossil fuels, expressing to your representatives your concerns with this regard. But then, of course, also on the adaptation side, what is our government going to do to meet its human rights obligations and assure that the communities that are most at risk of climate harms have the resources that they need to respond and manage those impacts.
Great, thanks so much. All of you will have, who live in Ontario, some of you may have joined us from other parts of the country, but if most of you are from Ontario, you're going to have an opportunity to ask your candidates for the provincial legislature what their views are on issues related to dealing with climate change, helping communities to adapt, reducing emissions, because they're going to be at your front door. I know I've had 3 of the candidates at my front door in the last 48 hours. So they're definitely looking for your vote. So make sure that you ask them what they'll be doing. Environmental Defense and a number of other organizations in Ontario have worked over the last year on a document, which we call our priorities document. So that is asking and working with all the parties to have things in their platforms that will deal with these issues. We have sent them all a questionnaire to respond to on how they're going to move these issues forward. The due date for that, I think, was yesterday. So we'll be putting out a summary of that. It'll be a website. You'll be able to see what all the 4 main political parties in Ontario are saying that they will do if elected. We'll be making that available to all of our supporters. So if you're on the Environmental Defense supporter email list, we'll be letting you know about that. And that can help you ask questions to your MPP, and it'll also give you a sense at a party level which of the parties are committed to doing particular things related to adapting to climate change and reducing our emissions and transitioning to a cleaner economy where we use much less fossil fuel and invest in livable communities and better public transportation, et cetera, and better housing. So have a look for that. That's upcoming. And I just want to thank you all for showing up today and participating and asking questions. And it was really great to have you all here. And it would have been nice to see some of you, but such as webinars. And thanks so much to Rachel LaFortune for joining us today and for the incredible work that her organization has done with Indigenous communities, and to the Indigenous communities themselves who are providing their time and effort to work with Rachel to bring their stories forward, trying to bring attention to these issues for the rest of us, for our collective benefit. Based on the experience that they're having. So thanks again for being here, and look forward to being in conversation with all of you on this important topic going forward, and have a great day.